So this is Blender. We've just loaded this up, and one of the first things you'll be presented with is a camera, a light, and a basic polygon cube. And a lot of tutorials just say just select everything and delete everything. What I'm going to do is just really talk you through just some of the interface options that you've got in front of you and how to get about inside Blender. In any 3D package you would be using some combination of keys and mouse controls. I've not turned on the mouse controls, so I'll try and talk through the mouse controls as we sort of go through them. But it's pretty much straightforward. What we're looking at right now is a 3D canvas. So this is a virtualization of 3D space where a coordinate system is being pushed across. It's being mathematically generated inside the computer and the software, and you're seeing an XYZ coordinate system. These are all based on the Cartesian coordinate systems to René Descartes, the mathematical French philosopher. So if you want to research that, that's useful. It's useful to understand that you work in planes of axis, so you work in a ZY axis or a ZX axis or a YX axis, and understanding that those are orthographical axes. And then in a perspective axis we can see that we've got a forced perspective where the vanishing points are being set to the camera. So you can see, look, as we turn the camera around using the middle mouse, click and hold, you can do what's called Tumble the View. Now these I do, as I'm an ex-Maya user, so I tend to say that it's the camera, but technically in Blender you're not actually in the camera, you're just in a viewport mode. The camera actually exists over here as a separate entity, and we're not actually looking inside the camera. If we want to look inside the camera, we just press this little icon and that will take us to the camera's view. And there's layout and modeling viewpoint, we don't need to concern ourselves with the cameras. So I am going to delete these two items. So I'm just going to left mouse click and drag. That's a box select, which is the current selection mode. So if I just go over to the toolbox, if I press T on the keyboard, T is the quick key to hide and show the toolbox. If we want to drag these out, we can drag them out so we can see what they're actually called, which is quite useful. And these are changeable depending on what type of mode we're in. So currently we're in object mode, so that means that we're selecting the topmost part of an object in the hierarchical chain. So here you see that the light, the actual light options, and the light coordinate system are two separate entities. They don't exist in the same place. So that means that we can animate things inside the options. So we could animate things like light, color, etc. If I just turn on the rendered view, you'll see here we've got the light shining onto this cube. It's shining at 1000 watts, and if I change the color of that light will change. But also if I go into the object properties, I can actually move the object around. So I can move, if I reset these coordinates to 0, the light will return to world 0. And then if I move this up a certain amount, it will change the amount that it moves up, and that's moving in the z-axis. As you can see, that we've got the z-axis as the blue point on here. And if I left mouse click and drag, I'm actually moving this in the y-axis, and I'm also moving it in the x-axis. So that's sort of a good way of looking at XYZ and how things move around inside 3D space. So I will delete this, and I'll delete this. And the cube is now grey. By default, Blender is using the Eevee render engine, which is picking up the world coordinate colour. So if I change this colour to black, we will see nothing because we're giving it no lighting information at all. And similarly, if I change this to white, then we're gonna burn out the colour all over. Now it's the strength of the world is currently set to 1, so you would see some shadowing going on. As you can see, there is a faint shadowing in there, and if I was to turn that, say, to 10, that would begin to disappear because we're blowing out the colour information that's in there. And that would be the same for whatever colour then we apply to that background. So for instance, if we were giving it a green screen type effect and we wanted this object to have a different material, And what this will do is this solid viewport mode is going to use shading materials that are just pre-lighting the objects. So it's not really using any real world lights. So we're using a studio lighting, and we can actually change where that lighting is. Depending on the type of model that we've got in the scene and what we're trying to see. We can change the colours by object, we can give random colours, which is quite useful. We can just also change the material type, so we can have different types of materials. So this one gives a really shiny material. So let's go back to studio mode. It's a better way to focus. And that's our first introduction Blender interface, just to move us around. I'm not going to talk about timelines and all the other windows. Some things that you might want to remember are inside Blender you can drag windows across to create new window layouts. There are lots of layouts you can choose from, and the layout itself is sort of semi-edited. So that if I go into modeling layout and then go back to layout, I've got these two windows still. So say if I'd made this into a 3D viewport, but I'd made this into an orthographical one, only looking at, let's say, the front view, like this one, and I made this one so it's a wireframe. So I'm actually looking at the object in wireframe. This would be my this could be the layout that I'm working in. When I go to modeling, I've got a different layout, and I'm using a different shading setup. Everything's separated out. If I went to sculpting, I would have a sculpting layout. UV editing would give me a UV editing layout, texture paint, etc. Shading, animation, rendering, compositing, and scripting. So there's a layout being designed for most eventualities inside Blender. So deleting things in Blender is pretty easy. You just right mouse, click, drag, select, and press either the X key to delete or the delete key, which auto deletes. So that's deleted it out of our hierarchy. If you're coming from Maya, it's best to think about this as the outliner and the actual channel box, sort of in one setting. You can move these things around quite easily. So if Workspace isn't a problem, say for instance if we were in layout mode, I'm just going to duplicate this, and let's say we didn't want the outliner here. If you just drag this one, you get this arrow. Right mouse click to deselect if you don't want to do it. Just dragging up, that will actually collapse this into one line. So if you think about this as being your outliner, for instance, this is really just for Maya users, and then if you dragged over on this side and set this, you could actually set this to, they actually call it the outliner. So therefore you'd have pretty much a similar sort of setup to what you might have had before. You could actually then drag in a bottom pane as well. So you've got your outliner in the top. Sorry, you've got your channel box in the top, which is where you always have all your sort of whatever object it is. If I just Shift D, duplicate that. So we've got cube. This is cube 1 and cube 2, and then we could do things with cube 2 just like we could in there. So there is a way of resetting your scene that helps you as well. But I think the best advice for me is just commit to Blender if you're a Maya user and just learn the tools. So just quickly on moving around. So to track your camera inside Blender is Shift and middle mouse. To dolly around the object is the middle mouse button. Your zoom in and out is the rolling of the middle mouse button. So literally everything's controlled by the middle mouse button. If you hold Alt and move the tumble, you can actually snap into different 3/4 views, which is quite useful if ever you're wanting to just set up in that sort of viewport. So it works as far as an interface goes. For me, it works quite well. It takes a little bit of getting your head around, and obviously now that since Blender 2.8, everything is sort of on the more standardized left mouse click drag to select things. In 2.7, it was right mouse click, which was really weird. And you have your context menu when you're using your right mouse button. So these are pretty easy, pretty cool to easy in use as we're moving around. And I think that will get you started. And if you're struggling with moving objects, the toolbar has some move tools that you can lock movements in. Makes things pretty easy to do. Rotate, very much like you would have in Blender or Max, and scale and everything else. However, when we're modeling, we will be using the hotkeys that Blender uses, which for let's just reset these to 0. In Blender, the hotkeys are the most powerful bits of Blender for me that I've found. So if I'm selecting an object and I want to move it, I'll press G. G will give me free movement, but then if I press any of the axes, so if I press X, I will lock on the X axes. Z, I'm locking on the Z axes, and Y, I'm locking on the Y axes. And it's based on where my cursor is, which is quite useful. I mean, if the cursor comes off the axis, obviously it's going to be there, but it's mirroring across. If I hold down Shift, it will slow the movement in a bit of an increment way. And if I'm going off the screen, it's basically just rolling through that and adding that on. So, and if I don't want to commit to the option that I'm doing, if I just right mouse click before I press the left, it just undoes everything that I've just done. So again, if I'm pressing if I'm pressing G to move, which is the grab tool effectively, and then Z to go up and down, it will only apply that movement when I press the left mouse button to release it. And then what I will actually get is this little pop-up window that says, were you accurate enough? And if I was trying to aim for 2.5, I can actually just nudge that up and it will actually be at 2.5. So there's a good little bit of movement there. We'll go into orientation and everything else and proportional editing as we get into further things. But that's a good Control Z undoes anything that you've just done. So the rotation tool, R, again, that's going to rotate in the camera view that I'm currently looking in. But if I do R and Z, then I'm only going to be rotating in Z. If I press Y, it's only going to be in Y. If I press X, it's only going to be in X. And if I right mouse click, then I do not commit to that. So that's pretty useful as well. And then scale is S. So S to scale. And again, if I want to scale only in Z, I press the Z key. If I want to press, if I only want to scale in Y, press the Y key, and X, the X key. And then right mouse click not to do anything. Now, as a caveat to that, or as an add-on to that, I should say, and Blender's full of add-ons, if I press G and Z, I'm moving in Z. But what if I don't want to move in Z? What if I only want to move in the X and Y coordinates? Well, if I press Shift Z, then it will take the Z coordinate out of the equation. And now I'm only moving along that plane that is the X and Y plane. And if I pressed G and Shift Y, then I would only be moving on the X and Z plane. I wouldn't be moving on the Y plane. And that's the same for anything else. So if I was using rotation and Z, Shift Z, then I would only be rotating. I wouldn't be rotating in any of the others I'm locking in. And the same for scale. Shift Z, then I'm not scaling in Z. So the Z is always going to be the same height, but I'm actually scaling in the Y and the X. So those just some quick hotkeys that will help us as we're moving through. And that's the interface more or less covered.